The announcement landed like a sealed door closing inside the royal family. Charles had not merely adjusted a schedule. He had removed Andrew from the palace event plans and named Edward as lead organizer, turning a private decision into a public fracture. In one stroke, an old royal wound reopened. A quieter brother stepped forward, and the monarchy sent a message no one could ignore. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew the words would wound before they even left the page. The palace event plans the private list of who manages duties, guests, timing, and family roles before a major royal gathering had been designed to show unity. Now, they had become a test of control. The king believed the ceremony could no longer carry Andrew's shadow. Every chair, every name, every approval would be watched. If Andrew stayed near the center, the event would stop being about the crown and become about him. Andrew sat in a private room as the decision was read aloud. He did not interrupt. His expression tightened, like pride turning into disbelief. Charles stayed still across from him, refusing to fill the silence with comfort. The monarch had made his choice, and the choice was brutal. Andrew was no longer part of the planning duties. He would not oversee movement, briefings, guest order, or ceremonial placement. The old access was gone. Edward received the news in a separate conversation, and the younger brother did not smile. He lowered his eyes, because he understood the cost. Lead organizer meant the person trusted to guide the royal program from behind the scenes, and that trust had now been placed on him instead of Andrew. Edward had earned respect through patience, but this was no clean victory. His rise came wrapped in humiliation. The sealed folder made the decision feel final. Andrew's name was removed from the table. Edward's replaced it. No speech could soften that gesture. No polite phrase could hide what the palace had done. Andrew had expected a quiet return to influence, perhaps a sign that time had cooled scandals. Instead, he was pushed away when the family might have let him closer. Charles understood the danger. The event was supposed to project discipline and trust, not reopen questions the monarchy could not afford to answer. That was why the king acted before hesitation could weaken him. But the deeper shock waited beneath the order, because this removal had not come from nowhere. Something had forced Charles's hand, and the palace knew exactly what it was. Behind the palace announcement were not just titles and timetables. There were brothers shaped by very different lives. Andrew had spent years fighting the shadow of disgrace, still clinging to the belief that royal blood could open doors again. Edward had built his standing through patience, duty, and silence. Charles now stood between them, not as a brother first, but as a king protecting a crown under pressure. Charles understood this event had become more than a ceremony. A royal ceremony means an official family gathering, where every role, seat, and public moment sends a message about power and trust. The king knew the country would not only watch who entered the room, people would watch who stood close, who stayed back, and who looked like they still belonged. That was why the decision mattered. One wrong face in the wrong place could turn the whole event into a reminder of old damage. Andrew felt the blow before anyone explained it twice. He had believed time might soften the walls around him. He had believed family loyalty still had weight behind closed doors. But Charles's choice told him something colder. The palace was no longer making room for his return. The king was measuring risk, not emotion, and that made the betrayal feel sharper. Andrew was not being shouted down. He was being quietly moved aside. Edward carried the other side of that pain. He had never chased the spotlight with hunger. He had taken smaller duties, quieter rooms, and less praise, and he had done it without making the family pay attention. Now the same silence that once kept him in the background had become the reason Charles trusted him. Edward knew the role would make him look favored, but he also knew the truth. He had not taken anything from Andrew. The king had handed him a burden. Charles had one private fear, and it would not leave him. If Andrew entered the planning meetings, the event could be overshadowed before it even began. Guest lists would become rumors. Seating choices would become signals. Every palace corridor would carry a question the monarchy did not want asked. The king had seen how quickly one family wound could swallow an entire public moment, and he refused to let that happen again. Aides noticed the silence before the signature. Charles looked at the final plan and asked only one question. Would the public see stability or scandal? No one rushed to answer. They did not need to. The question already carried the verdict. Edward represented calm. Andrew represented danger. That was the truth Charles could no longer avoid. But the answer did not begin with this event. It pointed backward, toward a hidden moment that had changed the temperature inside the palace. One conversation, one sharp remark, one mistake Andrew could not pull back. Every royal rupture has a moment people later pretend not to remember. This one began during a private rehearsal dinner inside the palace, when Andrew challenged Edward's authority in front of senior aides and dismissed the event plan as soft management. The room went silent. Edward said nothing. Charles heard about it before midnight. By morning, the king understood that silence was no longer protection. It was permission. Andrew had not expected his words to travel so fast. A rehearsal dinner means a private practice gathering before a major royal event, where family members and aides review timing, seating, and responsibilities before the public ever sees anything. That was why the insult mattered. It did not happen in a casual corner. It happened in front of trusted staff, at the exact moment the family needed discipline. Andrew had questioned Edward's ability, where respect was supposed to hold the room together. Edward absorbed the remark without answering. He did not raise his voice. He did not defend himself. He simply folded the seating chart, kept his eyes low, and left before anger could betray him. That silence made the moment heavier. Those close to Edward saw the change in his face, the tight control, the hurt pushed down, because duty demanded it. He had spent years proving that quiet service mattered, and Andrew had reduced it to weakness in one careless sentence. Andrew later insisted he was defending tradition. He told one close courtier, in a private conversation later documented in palace notes, that the event needed stronger hands and not soft management. But the words revealed more than confidence. They exposed fear. Andrew could feel the family moving without him. He could see Edward being trusted with doors he once expected to enter. His anger was not only about the plan, it was about losing his place. Charles heard the account before midnight, and the details came from two separate aides. That mattered because it showed the problem was no longer private resentment. It had become visible disruption. The king sat with the report in silence, replaying the moment again and again. He understood that if Andrew could challenge Edward before staff, then planning meetings could become a battlefield of pride, status, and old wounds. Charles ordered the rehearsal notes collected. Rehearsal notes are simple written records of what was discussed, who attended, and what concerns were raised before an event. The king did not ask for them because of cold procedure. He wanted proof of the line Andrew had crossed. He wanted the moment fixed on paper before anyone could soften it, deny it, or bury it under family loyalty. Andrew soon learned the remark had reached the king. The knowledge hit him harder than the original argument. Edward had not fought back, but the silence had still carried power. Charles now had the trigger he needed, and once that happened, the confrontation could no longer be delayed. And when two brothers finally stood before the monarch, the palace no longer felt like a home. It felt like a judgment chamber. The confrontation was brief, but it cut deeper than any public statement could. Charles met Andrew with no advisors present, only a folder on the table, and the weight of a decision already made. Andrew entered expecting negotiation. He found finality. When Edward's name was spoken, the room changed. It was no longer about an event. It was about who the king still trusted. Charles had chosen the direct path, because the rehearsal dinner had left him no space for soft messages. A private royal meeting means a closed conversation, where family decisions are handled away from staff, cameras, and public pressure. That mattered because the king wanted Andrew to hear the truth from him, not through palace whispers. He knew the decision would hurt, but he also knew delay would make the wound worse. Andrew had crossed a line in front of aides, and now the answer had to come from the monarch himself. Andrew listened at first with a hard stare. He expected Charles to mention limits, warnings, maybe a smaller role. Instead, the king said Edward would lead the event plans. Andrew's face changed. Disbelief moved first, then anger, then something closer to humiliation. He asked whether years of loyalty meant nothing. Charles did not raise his voice. He simply told him that loyalty could not become risk, and family history could not be allowed to damage royal duty. Edward was not in the room, but his name filled every corner of it. Lead organizer meant the person trusted to guide guest arrangements, ceremonial order, security briefings, and palace coordination from behind the scenes. Those duties mattered because they shaped how the monarchy looked before the public ever saw the final event. Charles made it clear that Andrew would not oversee any of them. Not temporarily, not quietly, not through another channel. Charles struggled before saying the final words. He placed his hand on the folder, as though the paper itself carried the weight of blood. Removing Andrew was not easy for him. The king was not cutting off a stranger. He was cutting back his own brother, and that made the silence almost unbearable. But the monarch had already decided that pain inside the family was safer than damage in front of the country. Andrew pushed back. He warned Charles that people would see division, that the family would look broken, that Edward's rise would look like a public punishment. The king answered with quiet force. Division already existed. The duty now was to stop it spreading. That answer ended the argument before Andrew was ready to surrender it. Andrew left without another word. The door closed behind him, soft but final. Charles stayed seated, his hand still near the folder, knowing the decision had now become real. And that quiet sound did not end the crisis. It began the fallout. Power inside a palace rarely announces itself loudly. It moves through folders, seating plans, whispered approvals, and the name written at the top of a page. When Edward's name replaced Andrew's, the monarchy changed direction without a trumpet, without a balcony, without ceremony. Charles had chosen calm over bloodline entitlement. And in that choice, the king revealed who now carried the future of royal order. Charles sat alone with the revised event structure, reading every line as though each duty carried a warning. Event structure means the planned order of responsibilities, timing, guest movement, and family roles that keeps a royal gathering from falling into confusion. That mattered, because a high-profile event was never only about who attended. It was about what the public believed afterward. If the family looked steady, the crown looked strong. If the family looked divided, the crown looked weak. Edward's name appeared beside the duties Andrew once expected to influence. Guest movement, family positioning, briefing coordination, ceremonial timing. Each line gave Edward more control, and each line took Andrew further from the center. Charles did not rush through the page. He read it slowly, then set the paper down with visible exhaustion. The king had protected the monarchy, but the cost sat heavily on him. He knew this was not just management. This was a public sign of trust. Edward accepted the role with restraint. He did not treat it like victory, and he did not speak as though he had been waiting for this moment. When he told Sophie, his voice carried more weight than pride. Sophie listened carefully as he said, it felt like duty, not reward. The trusted confidant understood him immediately. She knew Edward had earned this through patience, but she also knew patience had now placed him in the middle of a family wound. Sophie watched him carry the news quietly. She did not push him to celebrate. She knew the palace would see his appointment as a rise, but Edward would feel the burden underneath it. The role made him responsible for calm, order, and discipline at the exact moment his brother had lost all three. That contrast was painful. One brother was being trusted because he stayed steady. The other was being shut out because his presence threatened to pull the event into controversy. Charles gave the final instruction with no drama. All future planning decisions would go through Edward. Palace aides understood what that meant. Andrew was not simply removed from one meeting. He was cut out of the machinery. No side approvals, no quiet influence, no hidden path back into control. Andrew had not yet seen the full shape of what he had lost, but the palace had already moved around him. The doors were still standing, the corridors were still familiar, and the family name was still his. Yet the access was gone, and the moment that old access disappeared, Andrew began to understand that this was not a warning. It was a removal. The first consequence did not arrive as a headline. It arrived as an empty chair. Andrew walked into a planning corridor expecting to be briefed, only to find the meeting already underway without him. His name was missing from the attendance list. Edward was at the head of the table. No one raised a voice. No one needed to. The silence told Andrew everything the palace would not say aloud. Andrew stopped outside the meeting room as the truth settled over him. A planning corridor means the private palace passage, where aides move between rooms, carrying schedules, approval notes, and last-minute event instructions. That mattered, because this was where access lived. If a person was meant to shape the event, staff waited for them there. If a person was no longer needed, the corridor simply moved on without them. Edward's office had already become the new center of command. Palace staff were redirected there for approvals, instructions, and changes to the revised event plans. Revised event plans are updated arrangements that replace an earlier version when the palace changes roles, timing, or authority. This mattered because the change was not waiting for Andrew to accept it. It was already working. Every aide who walked past him confirmed it without speaking. Andrew looked for the usual signs of belonging. No briefing packet waited in his name. No seat had been kept for him. No staff member stepped forward to ask for his view. The absence hit harder than a public insult. He had been removed so cleanly that even the room seemed to have forgotten him. Anger crossed his face first, then humiliation. When an aide quietly told him the meeting was now restricted, Andrew understood the word fully. Restricted meant closed to him. Edward noticed movement beyond the door and lost his rhythm for a moment. He saw enough to know who stood outside. The younger brother tried to continue speaking about guest movement, but his voice tightened. He was now leading the very meeting Andrew had expected to enter. Success had put Edward at the head of the table, but suffering stood just outside it. The guest map had changed too. A guest map means the private layout showing where each royal person moves, sits, and appears during an event. Andrew had been shifted away from the central ceremonial pathway and placed outside the core family movement. That mattered because palace placement is never random. Closeness shows trust. Distance shows warning. A private instruction made the exclusion final. Staff were told not to seek Andrew's approval on any event matter. The order was practical, symbolic, and total. Andrew was not merely outside one meeting. He was outside the system. Yet the hardest moment still waited. Not in a corridor, not at a table, but in a private exchange between two brothers, where the palace could no longer hide the human cost of the decision. There are moments when royal titles fall away and only family remains. Edward found Andrew in a quiet room after the meeting, away from aides, papers, and protocol. For the first time since the decision, the two brothers spoke without anyone translating their pain into palace language. Andrew was wounded. Edward was steady. Neither man won, but one of them finally accepted what the other could not. Edward chose that room because he refused to let the decision become only a palace transaction. A palace transaction means a cold official change handled through staff, folders, and instructions, instead of honest family words. That mattered, because Andrew had not only lost access, he had lost it through silence, through missing papers, through doors that no longer opened. Edward knew the machinery had already moved, but he also knew his brother deserved to hear one human voice before the public noise began. Andrew looked at him with anger that barely covered the hurt. He believed Edward had accepted a place that should never have been his. In Andrew's mind, seniority, history, and blood still mattered. He had stood closer to the center for years, and now the younger brother was being trusted where he had been removed. That wound cut deep because it did not feel like a schedule change. It felt like replacement. Edward did not answer with pride. He told Andrew softly there was no victory in watching family lose ground. The younger brother said he had not asked Charles for the role, and he had not planned to rise through anyone's humiliation. But he would not apologize for serving when the king believed the monarchy needed calm hands. Edward's voice stayed controlled, but the pain beneath it was clear. Duty had placed him where love made him uncomfortable. Andrew pushed harder. He asked whether Edward understood what it meant to be made the example. He said the palace had chosen a version of him that was easier to manage, easier to blame, easier to move aside. For a moment, the older brother's anger broke into something more honest. He was not only furious at Edward, he was grieving the fact that his family no longer trusted him near its most careful moments. Edward heard it and did not look away. He understood then that the decision had already settled between them. Not as ambition, not as revenge, as responsibility. Andrew could demand that the role be handed back, but Edward could not return trust that Charles had already withdrawn. Andrew stopped arguing at last. His final words were quiet. "The palace has chosen its version of me." That was the turning point. Edward said nothing, because there was nothing left to soften. By the time the brothers left the room, the private fracture was ready to become a public story. And once the palace doors opened, the country would see not the paperwork, but the wound beneath the crown. By morning, the private decision belonged to the world. The front page showed two photographs side by side. Andrew leaving the palace with a fixed, pale expression, and Edward arriving later with a black folder under his arm. The headline was merciless: "King chooses Edward." Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered, phones raised, murmuring the same question: was this discipline or exile? Andrew saw the paper before anyone could hide it from him. A newspaper front page means the main cover story that tells the public what matters most that day. And this one mattered because it turned a private family decision into a national judgment. The contrast was cruel. Andrew looked like a man leaving power behind. Edward looked like a man walking toward responsibility. One image showed loss. The other showed trust. Together, they made the palace decision impossible to soften. Edward watched the coverage in silence. Broadcasters described Charles's move as a hard boundary around palace events, discipline, and the image of the monarchy. That mattered because royal events are not only family gatherings, they are public signals of control, unity, and confidence. If the king allowed Andrew too close, critics would say the crown had learned nothing. If Edward led calmly, the monarchy could show it still knew how to protect itself. Andrew turned the front page face down. He could not keep looking at Edward's arrival beside his own exit. The older brother had felt humiliation in the corridor, but this was different. This was public. This was permanent in ink. He understood that people would not see the pain behind the decision. They would see a simple story. Andrew pushed out, Edward chosen, Charles drawing the line. Edward felt no triumph as his name moved across the morning shows. The younger brother knew the public imagination could turn duty into victory too quickly. He had accepted responsibility, not applause. Yet the coverage made him look like the winner of a family contest he never wanted to enter. That troubled him, because Andrew was still his brother, and Charles's trust did not erase the hurt beneath it. Outside Buckingham Palace, The crowd grew just enough to make the moment feel real. Buckingham Palace is the monarch's main working palace in London, and when people gather there, it often means the public believes something historic has happened. Phones rose, voices lowered. Some called it discipline, others called it exile. But nearly everyone understood the same thing. Andrew's path back into royal life had narrowed sharply. The palace response stayed careful. A short statement praised Edward's steady leadership and confirmed the updated event structure. But Andrew's name was missing from the language that mattered. That absence said more than any official sentence could. Charles heard the noise from outside and understood the final weight of his choice. This was never only about who organized a palace event. It was about what kind of monarchy he was willing to leave behind. The final meaning of Charles's decision was not found in the schedule. It was found in the silence after the arguments ended. Andrew had been removed from the center. Edward had been trusted with the burden. Charles had chosen the monarchy's survival over a brother's wounded pride. The verdict was clear. This was not a temporary reshuffle. It was a royal boundary drawn in permanent ink. Edward moved the event plans forward with quiet control. Event plans mean the full working structure behind a royal gathering, including timing, roles, guest movement, and family placement. That mattered, because the palace had now accepted the new order without turning back. No one waited for Andrew's approval. No one held a seat for him in the command circle. Every instruction passing through Edward's hands proved the same thing. The crown had chosen steadiness over old expectation. Andrew was left with a truth more painful than anger. His family had not erased him, but it had stopped building royal moments around him. That difference mattered, because removal from planning was not the same as removal from blood. He still carried the family name, but the palace no longer treated his presence as useful to its future. Andrew could survive the headlines. What wounded him deeper was knowing the machinery had learned to work without him. Edward carried the role with quiet seriousness. He did not wear the responsibility like a prize. He carried it like weight. The younger brother knew his rise was tied to Andrew's loss, and that made every approval feel complicated. Duty can honor a person, but duty can also hurt. Edward understood that serving the king meant standing where his brother once expected to stand, and there was no way to make that painless. Charles did not act from cruelty. That was the deeper revelation. The king acted because the monarchy could not afford another event shadowed by Andrew's presence. A modern monarchy means a royal system trying to survive public pressure, public judgment, and public memory. Charles knew trust had become more valuable than rank. He knew discipline had become more important than comfort. And he knew one weak decision could undo the calm he was trying to build. Charles approved the completed plan alone. He read the final version slowly, then closed the folder with a heaviness that showed the cost. The monarch had protected the crown, but he had bruised the family. That was the burden of the throne. It did not allow him to choose only love. It forced him to choose what would last. This moment meant Andrew's quiet return was over. Edward's steady service had been recognized. Charles had proven that royal access was no longer guaranteed by birth alone, but by trust, discipline, and usefulness. The story ended with one brother outside the command circle, one brother carrying the responsibility forward, and a king who finally chose the crown's future over the family's past. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.